Hey, it's Art from my new microphone, and in this video I want to talk about an effective strategy for getting louder mixes, and no, it's not slapping a limiter or two on the mix bus. Limiting on the mix bus or master bus helps us to take full advantage of the potential for loudness in our mix by bringing it up and maximizing the signal level at the output. However, limiting in this way doesn't do a whole lot to improve the overall potential for loudness within the mix like this tip does. And this tip is to use serial compression throughout the mix. Serial compression, as the name would suggest, is inserting multiple compressors in series throughout a signal path. The easiest way to envision serial compression is to consider having multiple compressors inserted one after the other on an individual track or an individual bus. However, in practice, it's much more common to have a track, let's say, with a compressor or maybe two, that is feeding into a bus, which is also being compressed, and then that bus feeding into the mix bus, which has mix bus compression on it as well. Serial compression, again, is having multiple compressors in series throughout a signal chain, and that signal chain can go from a track through a bus and eventually hit the mix or master bus. But however we go about routing our serial compression, and no matter how many instances of other plugins are in between our compressors within a single chain, the output of the first compressor will ultimately reach the input of the second, and the output of the second will reach the input of the third, and so on and so forth. If we want a significant amount of gain reduction on a track or bus, and we only have a single compressor inserted in the signal chain, it can be rather difficult to get the desired amount of gain reduction without incurring negative side effects such as pumping, distortion, and other artifacts. However, when we opt to use multiple compressors in series, each compressor can share the load of the gain reduction we are after, and because each compressor is working less hard than the original single compressor would, we can achieve much more natural results with fewer side effects. If we are to maintain proper gain staging across these multiple compressors, we will achieve the same perceived loudness, often with a much quieter peak level. These peak levels would quickly eat up headroom when it comes to loudness maximization, and so by bringing them down a little bit with serial compression without altering the perceived loudness, we effectively give ourselves a greater potential for loudness in the mix. So enough of me talking to you directly about this concept. Let's hop into our digital audio workstation to see and hear how serial compression can help us get more loudness out of a mix. All right, here we are inside of Logic Pro to discuss serial compression and how it can be used to increase the potential for loudness in a mix. Now, in this session, we will be working with drums, as drums have a lot of transient and peak energy to them, and it's going to help me make the most obvious case for serial compression in your mixes to increase the potential for loudness. So we are going to compress these transients, bring down the peak level, and hopefully bring up the perceived loudness at the same time so that we can ultimately get more loudness out of these drums without necessarily altering the peak level. So let's open up this mixer quickly to see what we're working with. We have a kick, snare. This is a replaced snare drum replacement via a sampler. We have our overheads left and right and our two toms. So all of these tracks, except for this snare replacement, are acoustic drums mic'd up. And you can see here that all of these drums are being routed to bus 1. Bus 1 comes in here as the drum bus. Then drum bus is being routed to bus 30. Bus 30 here is our mix bus. This auxiliary track right here is how I'm speaking to you right now. So looking at the compressors, we will have a compressor on the kick and both of the snares. We'll have 2 on the drum bus and then 1 on the mix bus. So right here, let's start off by metering with the U-Lean loudness meter. I'll leave a link to that in the description box down below. And I will restart this. And then let's open up our mix bus compressor and have a listen through with just the mix bus compressor. And we will make a few notes here on the integrated LUFS, that's loudness units full scale, over the entirety of this first beat. And then also what the true peak max is of this entire section. So this will give us a pretty good idea of the perceived loudness here in the integrated LUFS, as well as the maximum peak of this section. So here we go. All right, so throughout that section, we have a max peak of negative 9.2 dB, and we have an integrated LUFS of 29.3, negative 29.3 LUFS. Okay, so that gives us roughly a difference of 20 dB. Going to make a note of this for later. And now let's have a look. I'll close that down for a second. On the compressor of the kick drum, we'll see that as we turn this on, we aren't going to be overworking this compressor too much. We only want a few dB of gain to really control that transient peak without overly altering the sound of the kick drum. So here's the kick just in solo with the compressor. So they sound almost identical there. Let's bring in the snare and have a look at this compressor. Not a whole lot of difference in tone there. Let's bring in the snare replacement. Again, not a whole lot of difference in tone there, just a few dB of gain reduction. Now let's go to the drum bus and bring everything in. I'll actually just go ahead and turn off solo now. And let's listen to the drums and then bring in these two compressors right here. The first compressor. Always A-Bing to match the loudness. Pretty close to me. Let's bring in the second one. Again, not a whole lot of gain reduction going on here. Now let's listen through, and I will do my best to turn off all of these quickly so that we can hear the difference between no compression and compression on the 3 tracks here and the drum bus. So all of this compression does change the overall sound of the drums. It makes them a little bit more weighty, gives them a bit more body. Of course, this is because we're curbing a lot of that transient information, even though we're only applying a few dB of compression here and there. However, in my opinion, this may even be an upgrade to the sound of the drums depending on the style or mix aesthetic that we are going for. So now that we have all of the compressors engaged, we have our notes from when we were only using the mix bus compressor. Let's open up our metering plugin once again. I will close this and let's have a listen. We've set up our gain staging so that it's pretty much the same perceived level. And we will have a look here at the integrated LUFS once again, along with the True Peak Max. Here we go. All right, so here we have a much lower peak of negative 16.4. The original one was negative 9.2. And our LUFS is negative 32.6 dB LUFS. So all of this compression actually dropped the LUFS about 3 dB, which means that we should perceive it as being quieter. However, if we look at the difference here, negative 32.6 to negative 16, that's about 16 dB difference. And so what we're left with is that by adding this compression, we effectively gained 4 dB of potential loudness as we bring up the signal to maximize the loudness of the mix. So let's say, for example, if we were to maximize the first option, which had a negative 9 peak and a negative 29 LUFS level, we would bring this up to, say, 0 peak just to make things simple, which means that we would bring up the LUFS level by 9 and we would be left with negative 20 dB LUFS, which is pretty close to what we would perceive the loudness to be of these drums. Now, if we were to take the example of serial compression in this example and maximize it, we would have plus 16 dB to reach 0 peak, which would mean that we would have negative 32 plus 16, meaning that we would be left with negative 16 dB LUFS, which will be perceived as being louder than the negative 20 in the first example. Of course, I know that this is sort of compression 101. What we're doing is compressing the dynamic range and bringing the peak and RMS levels closer together. However, I wanted to show you an example of how we could use serial compression in this case to bring up the potential loudness of the mix. But if we were to actually break it down, it's really quite simple. We are reducing the dynamic range of the kick and these two snares, and then we are going about reducing the dynamic range of the drums right here, and ultimately compressing the dynamic range again of the mix bus. So of course, as we go through this, especially in such a small mixing session, we will ultimately decrease the dynamic range of the mix. However, the key I wanted to show you here is that in these three example tracks right here, we have effectively used serial compression. If we take the kick drum, for example, the signal coming into the kick is being compressed at the track level. It's being sent to the bus right here, the drum bus, which is being compressed by two compressors in series, which is then being sent to the mix bus here, which is being compressed again. So ultimately, this kick will go through 4 compressors in series, as will this snare and this snare. And the rest of these tracks here will go through 3 compressors ultimately in series. So I hope all of that makes sense. Let's hop out of Logic Pro. If you found this video on serial compression informative, I would invite you to hit that like button and to also check out the My New Microphone mixing cheat sheet in the description box down below. I'll leave a link to that there. Of course, there are no cheat codes when it comes to mixing, as every mix is different. However, this mixing cheat sheet I put together acts as a great reference guide to help you make the right decisions at the right times within your mixes to help you achieve better results. So again, there's a link in the description box down below for that. And on this end screen, I want to point you toward a few other videos on the My New Microphone YouTube channel. One is about gain staging, which was discussed earlier in this video. And the other one is actually on using limiting to reach the full loudness potential of our mixes before even getting to mastering. So check out one of these, get yourself a free copy of the My New Microphone mixing cheat sheet in the description box below, and I'll see you in the next video.